Hi, this is Michael Miller, and this is my reflection video on the podcast, The Problem We All Live With. The topic of the podcast episodes is school integration, which means mixing schools' racial proportions by bringing in students of different ethnicities from outside school districts. The first episode, focusing on the negative perceptions about integration, tells the story of Nidra Martin and her daughter, Mariah, as Mariah was integrated into a wealthier, predominantly white school district after her own school district, which had a higher rate of students in poverty and from minority ethnicities, lost its accreditation. In the episode, Nidra tells of her frustration with the failing Normandy school district that is ignoring the needs of her daughter, who wanted to be challenged academically and engaged socially within the school, and expresses her frustration that Mariah was anchored to her failing school because of their geographical location. After Normandy loses its accreditation, over 1,000 students chose to be bused away to another school district who had no choice but to accept them based on Missouri state law. As shown in the second episode, this forced integration often causes the sort of violent backlash against the students seeking a better educational environment. Unfortunately, there was a terrible response from parents who themselves had struggled through the first botched attempts at integration back in the 70s. At a town hall-style meeting, parents of Francis Howell students raised concerns about their children's safety with all the multiracial students flooding in from impoverished districts, insisted that it wasn't a race issue, and even suggested moving up school start times to make it nearly impossible for the students from Normandy District to arrive at that earlier time. Mariah pushed through to go to the school and was surprised by the warm welcome of the students. The fate of the students, however, was once again thrown into chaos as the state took over the nearly bankrupt Normandy District and changed their accreditation status to non-accredited, a decision that later resulted in a public apology from state leaders who recognized that they had failed to educate these students. The second episode, focusing on the positive benefits of integration when people's mindset shifts from having integration thrust upon them instead of wanting it themselves, begins with the story of Kiana Jackson, a student who is Black and who integrated herself into a college filled with predominantly white students. When advising graduating students from her old high school, Kiana encourages them to reach outside of their comfort zone so that they don't become naive and miss the opportunities to learn from a wider variety of people. The episode continues with the story of John Britton's legal battles in Connecticut, where he fought for integration both inside and especially outside the courtroom. John knew that forcing integration does not create lasting change, so he sought to evolve the public mindset and make them want to start integrating. To do this, John brought in teachers, administrators, and even members of the Board of Education to testify about the terrible conditions in some schools in high poverty areas. His goal was to show the reality of schools in low-income areas to citizens who didn't live in those areas, to help them understand the necessity for integration. After suing the state and winning, John used the money to invest in the schools in those low-income areas in order to attract white students in other areas to integrate into these schools in order to increase educational opportunity for all students, as well as secure funding from the federal government. I think one of the biggest ideas that stuck with me is how successful integration can be for students, both from majority and minority ethnicities, as well as from different socioeconomic classes. Yet parents, educators, and even legislators still argue against it based on illogical fears. I loved hearing about how John Britton went about changing the mindset of the more privileged citizens in order to get them to want integration. It's one thing to force it on people through legislation, but it's another thing to help change people's minds through their own experiences. It was interesting to contrast the attitudes here with those of the Francis Howell parents. I think what's really important is what one of the teachers said in her testimony in the court case against the state of Connecticut. Quote, "I think that children can overcome the stigma of poverty. I think that children can overcome the stigma of their ethnicity, but what they cannot overcome is the stigma of separation." It's easy to see how systemic racism can be perpetuated in the first case of Normandy School District and the fierce but illogical reasoning of the parents, in contrast to the way that racism can be overcome by changing one family's mind at a time, like in the Connecticut story. I think one of the best ways to discuss any potentially sensitive topic is to ask questions about the other person's perspective. Rather than trying to assert my own logical victory, using empathy to find common points of connection before sharing an unbiased resource is a great way to understand that other person's point of view while slowly working to change their mind. I also think storytelling is a fantastic way to breach sensitive topics because it allows us to make an emotional and logical connection. Some people may never be swayed by an academic article, but they can't deny the stories that students, educators, and parents tell, like those from the Connecticut school districts. Lastly, I'm not sure that the topic of integration is beyond the traditional aspect of education. After all, schools across the country are hurting for funding, and local communities, state legislators, and the federal government have all implemented serious and various attempts to rectify this situation, but none have had lasting success, especially for the schools that are most in need. The parents from Francis Howell might argue that it's not their fault that the children from the Normandy School District live where they live, and that their child's privileged education shouldn't be affected as a result. But the stories like those of Mariah, Kiana, and John can all help to show not only the moral need for integration, but also how integration would benefit their children as well. Thank you.